Hello and welcome to Miss Joy Strube. Joy Strube is a CBC graduate, Canby Bible College proud alumni who has since gone on to serve in a variety of capacities and now is Community Outreach Director at Canby Foursquare Church. And so we wanted to invite you, Joy, to come participate in this process and just to hear about your journey that's led you to this point, some of the leadership lessons you've learned along the way, the challenges that you've had to overcome, and what animates you in this unique role that you have in helping a church identify needs in the community and then take meaningful steps to fulfill them. Does that sound about right?
Sounds great.
Excellent. So thank you for being here. Why don't you start by just giving us a sense of kind of quickly bringing us up to speed. How did you go from Joy Strube, person who attended church, to Joy Strube, now Community Outreach Director?
After high school, I moved up to Seattle and went to a Christian university up there studying sociology. And that was the first time I was introduced to the idea that the church is called to engage in something called social justice. In Seattle, I was introduced to the idea that social justice is essential to the gospel.
Interesting. Now, this is a somewhat controversial statement. I want to return to this in a second, but let's kind of keep the narrative moving forward. And I want to loop back around and kind of hear more of your thoughts on this idea of the social gospel. Okay, so what happened after Seattle?
After Seattle, I spent 4 months in Thailand studying and volunteering at an organization there. As part of that time was volunteering at a sex trafficking shelter. And it was my first time really rubbing shoulders with a lot of the concepts I had been introduced to in school. Suddenly, this concept of loving our neighbors who are hurting and broken had faces and names. I also really started to struggle with the fact that the setting I was serving in did not have any biblical foundation. It was not a Christian organization. And so a lot of the behaviors that would come up are things the girls were grappling with. We couldn't give any foundations or answers of hope or love beyond general behavior modification principles. Fast forward 6 months, I moved to Canby, Oregon, start an internship and start studying at Canby Bible College. And it is the first time I see a setting that is not, on one hand, really emphasizing social engagement to the exclusion of the gospel, or, on the other hand, solely proclaiming the gospel while minimizing the importance of being engaged in our community. It was at Canby Bible College that I learned that the foundation of God's throne are righteousness and justice. That we are called to a standard of living that reflects the perfection and righteousness of our good, holy God, and also called to reflect his unconditional love for those around us.
Interesting. Okay, so how did that begin to shape the kind of leader that you wanted to be and what you wanted to do with the next season of your life?
It started with a lot of listening and saying, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this information, with this call, with what I see as undeniable in Scripture, that God is a God who deeply cares about individuals, about the environment, about the world he has created, and that I'm called to care too. So I started asking a lot of questions. I would meet people who were loosely involved in something I thought might be similar to this. And I would say, hi, I think I might want to be you when I grow up. Can I buy you coffee and ask you questions?
I'm really fascinated about that experience. So just as an aside here, can you tell me just briefly, in those experiences, how have you found people to be receptive to that kind of, hey, can I sit down and bend your ear about this particular thing?
I have found people to be very receptive to that. when I would attend conferences and hear workshop speakers that were talking about something that I either felt could be useful or something that I thought I was supposed to glean or learn from this particular person, I would go up to them, introduce myself, and just ask. I decided early on I was okay being rejected. I was not okay being ignored. So I would knock down those doors and ask, because why not?
Because why not? And you found that in the knocking, generally speaking, people have been pretty receptive to sharing about their wisdom and experience and things like that.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Especially even asking the question opened a lot of doors. I've learned a lot about the power of questions, the power of asking why we do things a certain way or don't do things a certain way. Even asking the question shows a willingness to learn and grow that leaders want to feed into. Leaders see other leaders and want to develop other leaders. And so I've had a lot of leaders pour that into me, and I have in turn wanted to be that leader towards others.
Amazing. Okay, so let's return to this main narrative track that we were on. This is a beautiful aside about the power of kind of building a network and asking for help and finding that a lot of leaders are interested in providing that. So you're building this kind of idea about how someone in a position who wants to help integrate, if you will, the gospel and the social gospel together in a church context, what that looks like. And what else did you do during that season to kind of help define the problem that you were trying to solve or the issue that you were trying to tackle?
Well, the role started with a lot of listening. So not only did I seek out people doing similar things to what I thought I would want to do, really, I got into the community and started asking questions of my community, saying, what are the needs here? What good work is already happening here? Asking in small ways, what can churches do to support the great work you are doing when I was speaking to a nonprofit or a school. And gradually through asking those questions, through following up when we were given a small opportunity, trust was eventually built. And a lot of the initiatives we are currently doing between Canby Cares, our medical and social services outreach, Caris Lunch Buddies, our justice initiative during the summer, a lot of those are results of asking questions, being given small opportunities, and working as hard as we could to honor that, to honor those tiny slivers of open doors until the doors were opened wider and we got the opportunity to, what I see as, show God's love practically in even bigger ways.
Fascinating. No, you mentioned that you asked a lot of questions of your community. Drill down here. Let's be more specific. Who were the kinds of people that you were reaching out to get this information about the needs that were present in the community and how a church could help?
School officials, so met with several school principals, several in our police and fire department too, as well as officials in our cities, so our city councilors, various city employees, and just in general using opportunities around me to make conversation and get people's sense of what was going on in the community. So asking the coffee barista and building relationships there, getting to know the clerks at the grocery stores, because really the members in the community are the experts.
What I'm hearing you say is that there's a lot of curiosity that comes with this, that everybody has something that you can learn from in terms of kind of what are the needs present, with a lot of initiative, reaching out kind of if you will, uninvited or unannounced, and asking for some time with some high-ranking officials to get their perspective on things. Would you say that everything that you're doing now is a reflection of a problem that you've seen or a challenge that you've seen present in the community, and then you've tried to develop a program or initiative to help address a component of that?
Honestly, it started that way. And I'll be real transparent. If I could go back a couple years, I would do it a little differently.
Tell me how.
So it did start with identifying needs or problems in the community. We have a significant population that is either un or underinsured, and through various partnerships started our annual initiative to offer medical and social services. I absolutely see the value in addressing needs. Since starting my grad school studies in global development and justice, I've come across a field of study called asset-based community development. And essentially, this field says if we are only looking at community through the lens of their needs, we are essentially defining that community by what they lack.
Okay.
So I have gone in and reworked some of the initiatives that started as, what's the problem here? How can we solve it? And striven, and tried,
worked really hard,
and gone back into the community, made contact with our partners and worked to say, what is the good work that is happening here? What are the capacities? What are the assets? What are the resources here? And said, how can we partner with the good work that's going on here? So I'll use the example of Karis Elementary School.
Please, yeah. What does this actually look like in real life?
Yes. So there is a wonderful school, Karis Elementary, on the outskirts of our town. A couple years ago, I made contact with the school counselor there, and she described to me the dynamics of what were going on at the school. It was a growing school. A lot of the families in lower income areas of town were starting to be bussed out, and so to Karis School. And so at that point, you have two options when you are hearing about needs. You can say, wow, look, this is a needy community. We are needed here. Mm-hmm. Or you can say, wow, this is an amazing school. There are teachers that pour in and day out and show God's love in practical ways, whether they know it or not. There are families that are working so hard to provide for their children. Are there any small ways that we can be a part of the amazing work that's already happening?
Interesting. And so what did that question lead into? What came out of that piece of curiosity?
It started with a really small, hey, we have families that could use hygiene and clothing items, and that would really help and just be a great support. And so we started doing that, gradually started asking more questions. How else can we help? How else can we support you? Turned into an annual serve day at the school where we just partner with the school officials and say, how can we bless you going into the new school year? Whether it's setting up bulletin boards or raking bark dust. And then that gradually led the way to more trust being built, and we actually now have the opportunity to pair caring adults with students that the school counselor identifies could just benefit from extra adult emotional and social support, and having lunch with those students once a week.
Wow.
And so where I see asset-based community development or a strengths-based approach seeing into that or playing into that is it isn't these needy kids need an adult to come be their second parent. It is there are amazing kids who could use an adult in their life, another adult in their life, who could use another adult in their life to just care and be there alongside the great adults that are already there.
I love what I'm hearing. I just want to kind of make sure I'm tracking the progression correctly. This started with, one, a relational connection with somebody who was embedded at the elementary school. Mm-hmm. And from that, the question, hey, what needs might there be? And basically we arrived at toothbrushes. We need more toothbrushes for these kids, hygiene equipment, right? So you went back to the church and said, hey, church, there's a need for toothbrushes, and people responded. And then that folded into how can we help you prepare for the school year? And then that folded into how do we get a whole bunch of people on site now working, giving up of their time and energy to do that. And then that folded into how do we actually become part of the school support network for kids who need a lunch buddy or a reading mentor. And now we've got caring individuals connected to these students in ongoing relationship.
Correct. Yes.
It started with the toothbrush, and now we're in caring adults helping care for these students in a loving and Christ-centered way.
Yes.
That's kind of, I mean, I'm just reflecting on that now. It's like, that's a really fascinating and encouraging, beautiful model, right? Then you talked about how much trust was built and that the time that it takes to kind of to earn that equity into the relationship and the trust that's involved there. I find that very fascinating. For those who may be unfamiliar with the terminology, that's often talked about in terms of the social gospel versus the proclaimed gospel or something like that. What do people typically think about when they hear the term social gospel, and how might we modify that or help give more nuance to that definition?
So if you were to talk to a Christian prior to the 20th century and asked the question, are people who believe in Jesus called to engage socially and care for the poor and the sick?
Yes.
The answer would basically have been no duh.
Yes.
Or whatever the equivalent of what they said
in
the
1865. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
After the 20th century, there started to be theological divisions, as you would say the theological liberals started to debate some of the central tenets of Christianity. And so suddenly we found ourselves in this place where social gospel, social action, poverty alleviation even, unfortunately, practically caring for your neighbors was seen as an initiative to detract from biblical truth and the need to verbally proclaim the gospel.
I see. And almost became a substitute for it, right? So rather than proclaiming the necessity of people to receive Christ as Savior, it was if we can extend the love of Christ practically, those two things become functionally equivalent, and we're losing the call to individual conversion for the sake of a food line, if you will.
Yes.
Okay. And so then in response to that, you mentioned kind of that was, if you will, the liberal camp to the early part of the 20th century. What was the response to that, and how did those two camps kind of grow up over time?
The response on the conservative side of things, and these are also generally speaking, there were liberal Christians that held fast to the gospel and said we need to do both, and there were conservative Christians that held fast to both. But generally speaking, on the liberal side of things, there was this emphasis of social action above verbal proclamation. And on the conservative side or fundamentalist side of things, there was this emphasis on we need to proclaim biblical truth, we need to share the gospel with our words over and above, and oftentimes, unfortunately, substituting against social action or involvement.
I see. Okay.
So now we find ourselves...
Yeah, is there a third way in all of this?
Yes. So now we find ourselves where there are multiple generations who grew up with multiple experiences of this. There are the generations X and the baby boomers who grew up hearing in churches that the social gospel, so I'll use the term social justice from now on, because I do agree that social gospel is generally divorced from the gospel. So I'll use the term social justice because justice is in the Bible. All over the Bible. It is the thread that is woven throughout Scripture. And if that thread is taken out, The gospel, God's mention of redemption, God's mention of wholeness and human flourishing and peace and love all falls apart. It is not ancillary to the gospel. It is not a substitute. It is an essential part of the gospel.
I see. Okay.
And so our third camp here says God created the world designed to be in perfect harmony, fellowship, and peace with himself.
Yes.
So we were designed to have perfect relationship with God, perfect relationship with our neighbors, perfect relationship and understanding with ourselves and creation around us. When sin entered the world, it infused every aspect of that which God created good. Enter darkness, death, oppression, sin. God sets forth a story to redeem and set right and bring wholeness and flourishing. Social justice essentially says, I want to be a part of God's story.
Interesting.
With that, I want to partner with God. I want to be an agent of reconciliation and redemption and seek wholeness and life and peace and love and grace and truth in all of those four, unfortunately, fractured four relationships.
Fascinating. So you're advocating for that it's not a false dichotomy, that it's not an either or, and that and here, let me not put words in your mouth, but as you think about like how that applies, let's say in a local church context, churches have historically been, especially in the evangelical conservative tradition, very strong on proclaiming the gospel. And now you're in a position where you're helping give nuance and a different flavor to the gospel is also the gospel demonstrated. What challenges have you faced along the way in trying to kind of help a congregation or a church make that shift? And what conversations have you had with leaders and key stakeholders to help them see the work that you're doing as of vital importance, just as the proclamation of the gospel is?
Great question. First of all, in terms of there not being a division and the importance there, absolutely. We need both the verbal proclamation of the gospel as well as the relationship and actions and initiative that demonstrate that what we have to say is true. People aren't going to care what we have to say about God's truth if we're not actually living in a way that reflects the loving, just, caring, good, kind character of the God we serve.
Yeah.
And so when we live in such a way that reflects his good character, people ask questions. People notice. Canby Cares, which I'll talk about a little later, we have all kinds of different people coming to get medical or social services. And we have had so many people express surprise or ask the question, why is a church doing this? Or express surprise, I can't believe a church is doing this.
And what do you say when they ask that? Why is a church doing this?
We say we love the community we are a part of. We love the community where God has placed us. We love our neighbors, and God loves our neighbors too. So as we do some of these initiatives, we don't have a cross on the logo. We don't pull out a megaphone and say, repent, or verbally share the gospel. But we found a lot of times just by caring and being who we feel God has created us to be as loving neighbors, doors are opened to share because those questions are asked, because it's countercultural to care, to listen, to love. So to the extent that we're living differently than the world around us, in both behaviors and even in our concern for our neighbors, it's going to bring up questions.
All right, so let's shift gears here for a second and talk about Canby Cares, which is something that you've mentioned previously. Give us a sense for what the event is, and say a sentence or two, and why you feel like it's an important part of how this church body cares for its community.
So Canby Cares is a grassroots initiative, a partnership of local churches, organizations, and individuals that seeks to offer medical and social services to our neighbors with financial vulnerabilities in a festive and dignity honoring atmosphere. That actually goes back to the idea that we are all created in the image of God, which means we have inherent value, worth, and dignity. So I say dignity honoring rather than dignity giving because we don't give anyone dignity.
Ooh.
Human beings have dignity by virtue of the fact that they are created in the image of God. And we want to, however we can, even if it's one day a year, say we want to honor that dignity within you. That goes into the structuring of the event in a way that says you are more than just a recipient of services. You have dignity, you have things to offer, and we want to create a comfortable, loving, embracing environment where we can serve you and also honor all you do throughout the year. So
what does that actually look like? Give me an example of how you might express dignity, honor in an event like this.
Well, it started with serving breakfast and lunch. We said we don't want a dry, sterile event where guests are forced to wait in line for 4 hours and risk losing their spot. Instead, hey, let's go gather around the table and have lunch together, volunteers and guests. It grew into what we call a resource fair, which offers haircuts, kids' clothing, and different resources throughout the year that guests can offer.
Sure.
It also relates to the idea that everyone has something to offer. This shift from the word provide, which we used to say that we provide medical and social services, to offer, actually came about through an encounter I had our second year hosting the event. I arrived around 4:30 that morning, got to know the first guest in line, and she told me, "Thank you so much. This event means so much to the homeless community." Got to know her, thanked her for being there. A couple hours later, a piece of the event that I had completely not seen coming fell through. And this wonderful woman who I've since become friends with, we'll call her Sarah for anonymity's sake, but jumped out of line and gave me the best hug I have ever received. And it was in that moment that I realized our guests have just as much to offer us as we have to offer them.
Fascinating.
And so a piece of being dignity honoring is saying everyone is welcome to volunteer. Everyone is welcome to receive services.
Yeah.
So we have volunteers who come and realize that it's been 5 years since they've had an eye exam, so they jump in line. We have guests who come to get some dental treatments and realize that they want to be a part of this. And so they jump in and join our hospitality team that day and start distributing coffee or pastries. And that's another piece of the dignity honoring. We want to take this day, we want to make this space for you, we want to make it comfortable, and we want to treat you like you're in our home and you're our guest.
Wow. But the other thing that I'm really fascinated about is the kind of leadership principles that you have discovered, the wisdom that you've learned over the years, because what you're doing isn't easy. And I mean, just the sheer scope of the event that, let's say, Canby Cares represents, and correct me if I'm wrong, but basic numbers include, over 300 volunteers, at times almost 750 guests, over almost $100,000 worth of medical services provided from almost a dozen different providers, from eye doctors to dentists to podiatrists to flu shots to blood pressure medicine. I mean, the number of different people that you have collaborated around this one event is not insignificant, and none of that happens by accident. None of that happens without a lot of hard work. And so I would like you to reflect a little bit on your own leadership journey, some of the principles that you kind of keep in mind when you're setting about working with so many people. So let's just start there. Okay, if you could kind of summarize your leadership style, what would it be?
I would boil it down to 3 things. Be bold, embrace the awkward, and have an eye for capacity.
Okay.
So I'll talk about be bold first. Boldness involves, firstly, asking the questions no one else is asking. I learned this as I was having coffee with somebody doing what I wanted to do a few years down the road. And she does multicultural engagement at her church, and voiced this example of being in a staff meeting and someone says, we don't really engage the Hispanic community in our church. And oftentimes that's just kind of accepted as, that's our blind spot. But she encouraged me, be the person who asks why. So through this boldness in asking questions, in asking why things are a certain way, what else we could do, why are things not a certain way, that began to open doors, create relationships. Also, I would encourage boldness to dream, to say just because we have always done things a certain way doesn't mean it has to be that way. Canby Cares at Canby Foursquare actually came about because I came into our executive pastor's office, you at the time, and said, hey, that typical church event we do every fall, does it have to stay the same?
Yeah.
Can we make it a little more community oriented?
Sure.
And through that boldness of asking the question, an initiative that was born that went way beyond the scope of our 2-hour Wednesday evening event.
Yes. Yeah.
And is now bringing together various partners and individuals and churches in the community to offer services.
It's downright massive. Okay.
It started from the boldness to ask the question.
Sure.
Second, in terms of leadership principles, I would say embrace the awkward.
Yeah, tell me what you mean by this.
So this is an understanding I've come to in the past couple years that when Jesus was on this earth, he did not shy away from people or conversations just because they were awkward. And so I'm not called to either. I like to think of also, we have during the summer, a wonderful nonprofit, Bridging Cultures, hosts these bicultural lunches. And so it's the Hispanic and the Anglo community coming together just to have lunch and gather together in the park. Sometimes that's awkward. There is no structure. I don't speak the dominant language very well. And awkwardness is a huge non-starter for a lot of people from even attending these lunches. And it was for me at one point too. But I began to realize the awkwardness I feel that 2 hours a week on Saturday is what a lot of my neighbors are in the day-to-day. So some of my neighbors are going to the grocery store and not able to ask, hey, what aisle is the quinoa on? I can sit in that awkwardness for a couple hours to let those I am building relationship with know they are worth the awkward. I might not know what to say. I might not know what to do. I might not know what to do with my hands. But I can be there. I can show up because people are worth being awkward for.
Wow. That feels like it opens so many doors to possibilities with relationships that otherwise we would make a pre-decision to say, oh, I don't belong in that space, or I don't go there. But if you can go there humbly, respectfully, curiously, and be okay not being in charge, not being competent, which I know for me is a huge deal because I enjoy being competent. But if I can be okay with that, then suddenly I've got the possibility for friendships, for partnerships, for experiences that I would never have had otherwise. Fascinating. Okay, what's your third thing?
Third leadership principle is have an eye for capacity.
Oh, okay. So I would say that you have one of the highest capacities of anybody that I've ever met. So what have you learned in bumping up against your capacity and needing to keep an eye on it?
Can I come back to that? Because I meant something else by high for capacity.
Sure. It's still true, though, that you have one of the highest capacities of anybody that I've ever met. Okay, so what do you mean by keep an eye on your capacity?
So having an eye for capacity is twofold. One, an eye for the capacity of the community or populations you're serving. And two, an eye for capacity for ways that those around you can contribute. So first, when we talk about eye for capacity, it's the idea that God is God of all, everything. He has been at work far longer and far more extensively than when I or another community engagement coordinator or another missionary set foot on the scene. He is at work in every community, and there is capacity, there is resource, there are good things in the history of that community, and they have things to offer. And if I don't see that, I'm not seeing communities as God sees them, as full of capacity, as full of life, as having things to offer and contribute.
I see.
Secondly, an eye for capacity is needed because you cannot do this role alone, which is so hard for me to acknowledge because I am a doer. I like getting things done.
Sure.
But I have weaknesses like we all do, and I am surrounded by people that have strengths that I don't. So having an eye for capacity says, what are the strengths and giftings of the people around me, and how can they be a part of the story that God is crafting through this partnership or through this project or through this program? What is the capacity of those around us? And how can they be a part of something? Even asking that question, I've had teams assembled where leaders I bring on board say that they have never been asked or have had their giftings called out or acknowledged that those could be used.
Wow.
And we all have that thing to offer. We might not know what it is, but we all do.
Fascinating. That's beautiful. Now, can you speak to that other piece about your personal capacity as a leader? How do you, I think what you're doing is extraordinary on a lot of levels, including the amount of communication and detail and administration and leadership that's required to be able to pull off some of these events like Canby Cares is significant. What have you found helpful in making sure that the pace that you keep is sustainable?
Good question. I have learned that Sabbath is not a suggestion. Sabbath is not an option. Sabbath does not depend on what's going on that week. Sabbath is a biblical command. It is where God refreshes, where God meets you and helps you. No, not helps you. It is where God meets you, and it is from that place of rest that you find the sustenance and the grit to keep going forward. I used to think of Sabbath as something you earned after 6 days of working really hard. Through the teachings of A.J. Swoboda.
Love that guy.
Yes, I learned that Sabbath was actually at the beginning. It was meant to be the start of a new week. So it's not something you earn after 6 days of working hard. It is something you start with and say, okay, God, I rest, I lay this down, I give this to you by turning off my phone, by not checking email, by doing things that refresh and recharge and rejuvenate me. And then I go into the work and work really hard from that place of having rested and stopped and slowed and sat in the stillness, which is really hard. Capacity. Another thing for maintaining pace is inviting mentors to speak into your life, having those people who will tell you, no, you can't commit to this one other thing, and the spiritual discipline of saying no. Because when you find your powerhouse, your wheelhouse, your real passion, you are going to have countless opportunities. There are always projects to do. There are always relationships to build. There are always things that can fill your calendar. But when you are saying yes to one thing, you are saying no to another thing.
Oh.
And so I have had to learn the spiritual discipline of no to one initiative is an even more wholehearted yes to the things that God has already called me to engage in.
Are you suggesting that it's better to do fewer things well than many things poorly?
Yes, that is what I'm suggesting.
Fascinating. What a lesson. I'm still learning that one myself.
Me too.
Okay, that's really interesting. Tell me about one or two kind of key influences that have helped shape your Christian thinking up to this point in your world.
So the mission of God's people was a huge influence in terms of shaping my thinking about how we are all called to be part of God's story.
Yes. Now, this is a book by Christopher Wright, who's a British Old Testament theologian, called The Mission of God's People. Okay. So big kind of influence on you there.
Yes.
All right.
So essentially, that is where I learned that my job is to be an agent of reconciliation and redemption and partner with God's story.
Sure.
So in the day-to-day, my job is to look for ways in the practical that I can look and see capacity, look and see ways where God is already working and where I can continue to be a part of that.
Yeah. If you had 30 seconds, you say you're in an elevator, and someone comes to you, just like you have gone to many other people, and says, I want to be you. What do you tell them?
Show up, suit up, and follow up. Show up, be there more than the minimum.
Yeah.
Show that people are worth investing in, even when it inconveniences you.
Yeah.
Suit up, dress, walk, and talk like you want to be there and you have something to offer.
I see. Yeah.
Suit up, so focus on strengths and learn and ask a lot of questions, and then follow up. Leaders are willing to invest in you. Good leaders want to make other leaders. So do yourself and the leaders that will come after you a favor and let them know it was worth their time. Follow up by sending thank you cards, sending emails, following up on connections they offer about. Let leaders who invest in you know that you are going to take the little you are given and do a lot with it.
Fascinating. That's really good advice. Let's finish by just kind of continuing on that same theme. Let's say you had a little bit more time than 30 seconds for somebody who comes up to you and says, I want to be you. And maybe not just in the area of community outreach director, but somebody who wants to be... somebody who wants to carry a level of leadership in the space that they're in, that wants to command the respect of their peers and wants to be known for doing excellent work. I would say all of those are attributes of you. What kind of key markers do you think helped you get to that place, and what advice would you give to someone else to follow in those footsteps?
Seek to bring value to every relationship, every project, every team, every opportunity you're a part of. So ask the question, what do I have to offer, and how can I strengthen and make better the team I'm a part of? And this might be in very, very small ways at first. It might stay in small ways, and some of those ways might be smaller, some of those ways might be bigger. But if you're constantly looking for how can I bring value, people notice that. And when you get to those higher levels of leadership, you're not suddenly having to learn how to do things you're not suddenly having to learn how to operate in integrity and operate from a place of asking, how can I be a servant leader? Because you've been building those foundations from the get-go of how can I serve here? How can I set up these chairs the best I can possibly set them up? What can I be doing now to instill value?
Awesome. All right. Any last words of wisdom for young leaders?
You're worth investing in. Seek out people who are doing what you want to do. Don't be scared to ask the question. If they don't have time, they will say no. You are worth investing in. I was told that by several leaders and mentors in my life. And so I want to tell others that they are worth the time of developing and walking alongside. Honor that when you receive that investment, but don't shy away from it because you don't think you're worth it, because you are.
Amazing. Joyce Strube, Community Outreach Director, Canby Foursquare Church. Very thankful to have you join us today. Thank you for investing in us. Thank you for being an example of excellence, of great care and dignity for everybody that gets the privilege of being able to work with you. So thank you. Really appreciate you.
Thank you, James.
Absolutely.